And hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the final fall 2021 Visiting Writers Series event from Wells College. I am Dan Rosenberg. I'm the director of the series. And as always, we want to begin by thanking the New York State Council for the Arts. Their financial support has allowed this series to thrive for many, many years, bringing incredible writers into our community, and we're all grateful for that. And tonight, I'm very excited that Kazim Ali is going to be joining the ranks of writers who have read for us. I also want to thank Marion Brown at the Center for Sustainability and the Environment for partnering with me to host people like Kazim, whose work bridges our disciplines, or maybe, whoa. Yeah, that was me. Whose work bridges our disciplines, or maybe for me and Marion, I think part of what Kazim's work shows is that those disciplines are already in an ongoing conversation. And so, Marion, I'm looking forward to more collaborations with you. I also want to note that I'm joining you all from Ithaca tonight, which, like Wells College, is situated within the traditional territory of the Cayuga Nation, which is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. One of Kazim's most recent books, Northern Light, ends by asking us to try to answer some of these questions. Where does your electricity come from, and upon whose land does your home sit? And I think most Wellsians are familiar with the land acknowledgement and with the Cayuga Nation, but I wonder how many people at Wells know that it gets its electricity from renewable resources. And then I wonder how many of us who knew that also could say anything more beyond that. Say, for example, what impact those sources of renewable power have had on the environments and the local communities. And those are the questions that some of the questions that Kazim's book made me begin to ask. And I'm really grateful for the time in that book. But you're not here to hear about me. This is how the evening is going to work. I'm going to do my little preamble here, and I'll introduce Kazim, who will read. And throughout his reading, if you think of a question or a comment, or you just want to react to something that you heard in the reading, I invite you to please do it right in the chat here. During breaks in the reading, I'll jump in and give voice to your comment to sort of call Kazim's attention to it and give him a chance to respond. And that way, this event can be more of a dynamic discussion and less of a pre-digested event that you could have tuned into later. And that's the fantasy anyways, that we will be a little bit more interactive even though we're here on screens. I'm also putting in the chat right now links to how you can order Kazim's most recent books from our independent local community-owned bookstore in Ithaca, Buffalo Street Books. Those are three of his most recent books: Northern Light, which is a memoir / piece of lyrical journalism or literary journalism, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, which is a collection of poems, and The Citadel of Whispers, which is a choose your own adventure YA novel. And I'll remind you of that all again at the end. Enough logistics now. I'm going to introduce our reader. And normally I try to keep the biographical details pretty short, but that feels impossible with Kazim Ali. He was a political organizer and a lobbyist before turning fully to poetry and writing. And now he's a wildly prolific writer, an editor, a translator, and a champion of the works of others. And I've been a recipient of that championing, for which I will be forever grateful. It's a lot. I'm not clear on if Kazim sleeps. Oh no, are you there?
Going to.
You good, Kazim?
I'm here. It's a little rough. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. It's pretty bad. I hope it doesn't cause us a problem.
Okay. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So it's funny to be hosting Kazim in this medium because it is weirdly intimate, I think. Like, we're on Zoom peeking into each other's houses and offices and lives, which feels like, to me, living the intimacy that much of Kazim's work actually invites. It's personal, it's vulnerable, it draws us into a world where divisions and categories between genres, countries, communities, and identities all break down. He's referred to the genre queerness of his book, Bright Felon. which is prose or poetry or prose poetry. And even his official biography begins with a litany of many different homes. Kazim was born in the UK and has lived transnationally in the US, Canada, India, France, the Middle East. And so those of you who were in the masterclass earlier today know some of what I'm talking about with these sort of divisions of boundaries. It was a discussion of form, genre, experimentation, what it means to be American. And the thing that I kept thinking about on my drive home from work was how broad and inclusive and encompassing Kazim's thinking around these issues really was. And so that breadth is a beautiful thing about his work, and also one of the challenges here, because I usually don't know exactly what the reader is going to read tonight, but or ever, but tonight it could be anything. He's written several volumes of poetry, novels, nonfiction, translations. He's an editor at the incredible small press Nightboat Books. His newest collections are a volume of 3 long poems and 4 short ones, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, a memoir, which is also, maybe literary nonfiction, focused on the location of his Canadian childhood, Northern Light, Power Land and the Memory of Water, and the Citadel of Whispers, the YA Choose Your Own Adventure novel. We'll be hearing from some of these, and most importantly, we'll have the chance to just listen to what Kazim is sharing with us and to respond in the chat as we are here attending with our whole bodies. I'm very excited that Kazim is here sharing his work with us tonight. Kazim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I would love, first of all, I want to warn about my internet connection. I'm in my office at UCSC, so I apologize. The internet ought not be spotty, but it turns out that it is a little. So if I disappear or I freeze, just, I'll be back. I'm not going anywhere permanently. And it's great to be with you virtually. I wish that I could be with you personally. I did, of course, I grew up in many places around the world for my first 10 years, the first 10 years of my life. But when I was 10 years old, my parents moved to Western New York. And that is where I mostly grew up since then. Well, I mean, I left. I don't still live with my parents, but I'm fond. I spent a lot of time in the Finger Lakes area, including Ithaca, including Geneva, and other places. So it's Cortland and so on. So it's a region that's near and dear to my heart. The Finger Lakes and the Hudson Valley River region are like my heart spaces, heart homes. So you're very lucky to be there. It's powerful land. It's very embodied land. It's very spirited land. I think if you go somewhere a little bit away from humans and just listen, you'll be given life, basically. So I hope that you find time to do that in your life. I wanted to start by reading you the opening of Northern Light, just as part of what we're doing here. So Dan told you a little bit about the story, but this is how it started. I've always had a hard time answering the question, where are you from? The easiest answer, the one I've fallen back on as a convenience, though I had always supposed it to be as true an answer as any, is that I'm from nowhere. My father was born in India in Vellore, Tamil Nadu, and my mother in Hyderabad, which was then in a state called Andhra Pradesh, but is now a part of a new state called Telangana. Neither of them have formal birth certificates, only affidavits from neighbors attesting to their birth and their school enrollment certificates. As political refugees, both the families had fled the increasing sectarian tension of Tamil Nadu, of pre- and post-independence India. My mother's family relocated to the then independent Muslim-ruled kingdom of Hyderabad in 1945, and during partition, my father's family moved along with hundreds of thousands of other Muslims from South India to Karachi, which at that time was a mid-sized regional capital in the Sindh province on the Arabian Sea. Hyderabad, just for context, I want to explain to you, Hyderabad went from a population of about 50,000 people to something like 7 million people in the space of 4 or 5 years. So you can just imagine the infrastructural problems that came from that shift, and from which it has not quite in the last 50 or 60 years recovered. My father's later Pakistani citizenship has recently made it extremely difficult for me to travel to India because of new visa rules that that prohibit people with Pakistani ancestry, which is defined as parents or grandparents from Pakistan, to apply for multiple entry visas. And they require them to apply for their visas, not by mail like everybody else does, or by internet like everyone else does, but in person at a consulate. And so just for context to you, the closest consulate to where I am now in San Diego, the closest consulate is in San Francisco. So I would have to go to San Francisco and stand in a line and to get to my visa. When I lived in Ohio, the closest consulate was New York City. These rules resulted from recent tensions arising from the victory of the Hindu nationalist parties in the elections that are informed by a cultural movement known as Hindutva. You might have heard that phrase, an ethnic absolutism that, among other things, promotes an erasure of Muslim influence on Indian history and identity. And so besides the daily alienation I feel in growing as an American, I wrote this book in the spring of 2017. Any average American or Canadian tourist has a far easier time visiting the cities of my parents' and grandparents' births and ancestries than I do. It's hard to feel like I'm from a place that I have such limited access to, either culturally or physically. That is why I have a hard time now saying I'm from India or my family is from India, because I don't know what it means. And I have no connection to Pakistan. I've visited once in my 50 years of life. My family married, my parents married in 1967 during a period of political and military conflict between India and Pakistan, a conflict that prevented my father from attending his own wedding. Ever a practical religion, Islam provides for marriage by proxy, and that's how the ceremony was performed. Unable to live together in either India or Pakistan, my parents, like many young Indian families, followed economic opportunity to London, where my older sister and I were born. So we have a term for this now, we say economic migrants, because we've often, and you hear it in the dialogue around immigration, you often hear a distinction made about refugees versus a migrant. Like if someone is just, unless someone is trying to kill you at home, that doesn't count as being a refugee. But we now think we have economic refugees too, where there's no work in the country, or the people are trying to find a better life for their family. And we have what we could even say in the next, my friends, in the next 20 or 30 years, we will have climate change refugees from places in Asia and in the Pacific. I want to give you an example. Based on current projections of ocean rising, the coastal change in Bangladesh in the next 30 years is going to displace something like 30 million people. Where are they going to go? Is there a plan? I mean, has the UN talked about this? Is there are we going to, where's the housing for, what is going to happen? So we're staring a crisis, a refugee crisis in the face, a climate refugee crisis. And that's only one example, Bangladesh. That's one country out of however many countries there are. Where was I? They followed economic opportunity to London, where my older sister and I were born. After a few years there, my family migrated to Canada in the early 1970s when Pierre Trudeau and the Canadian government were creating policies to encourage immigration. That was a different era. That was when the leadership of Canada said, we want the best and brightest here. We actually want to make it easier for people to get here. And I mean, we can interrogate that term, the best and brightest, and you know, separate issue. But the point is that immigrants were welcomed because it was felt that they were bringing something to the welcoming country. They were thought of as a resource, not as a problem to be solved. Siblings of both my parents, as well as their own parents, soon followed. As if to imitate the spatial relationships of the shared living arrangements of the family complexes in Vellore and Hyderabad, my uncles and aunts moved to the same city, Winnipeg, in the province of Manitoba, and they lived in communal houses or had houses down the street or around the corner from one another. With their new landed immigrant cards from the Canadian government, they were also more officially documented in the new country than they ever had been in the old. So where is that? Oh, I want to read this, two more paragraphs here. My younger sister was born in Winnipeg, but we didn't stay there long. After a year or two of living along the Red River, we moved 500 kilometers north, around 300 miles, for those of you following along at home, to a town that doesn't exist anymore. But even after we moved north, we continued to drive south for visits as often as my parents could. What I remember about those houses in Winnipeg at 23 Harmony Cove and 168 Sterling Avenue, at 317 and 106 River Road, and at 10 St. Anne's Place, where my extended family lived, is those the houses that I visited throughout my childhood, is that the doors were always open. The screen doors would bang all day long with cousins running into the house to grab a snack and then out the door again down Harmony Cove and up Sterling Avenue, 100 feet and into another door. Perhaps I was always a wanderer. No house ever claimed me. I could wake up in one, eat in another, and bed down in yet a third. So what does it mean to be from a place? What rights does this give you? For what status does a place of origin qualify a person? And am I from India or Pakistan? The ground shifted beneath our feet. So that's the very beginning of the memoir that kind of introduces, you know, who am I in the first place? Where am I from? How do I say where I'm from? And where I really felt like I was from, that town that I lived in for 3 or 4 years as a child, from about 4 to 7 or 8, maybe more closer like 3 to 6 or 7. But it's the place my earliest memories are there. I have only one, like snatches of memories from before. It's also where I learned language. It's where I learned the alphabet. It's where I learned to read. It's where I learned to write. It's where I looked up into the sky and saw constellations. And my father told me the stories of the myths, you know, who the queen Cassiopeia was. So if I'm from a place, it's there. That's the place I'm from. And yet that town doesn't exist anymore. It was trailers. It was trailers. My father was an electrical engineer working for Manitoba Hydro, the province's electrical power authority, and it was his job that took us north. Genpeg was a small settlement of single and double trailers, built by Manitoba Hydro and perched on the banks of the Nelson River deep in the great boreal forests of the Canadian North. At the time, Genpeg was several hours by car on dirt roads from Wabodin, the closest provincial town, northwest of Genpeg on the Trunk Road between Winnipeg and Thompson, a mining town even farther north. Another town was even closer, Cross Lake, on the Cross Lake Indian Reserve. But it was inaccessible by road from Genpeg except in the winter when the lake had frozen over and you could drive across the ice. It is of this isolated town with its dirt roads and gravel driveways that I have most of my earliest memories. It was there that I first attended school, there where I learned to read and write, there where I first looked up into the sky and asked my father questions about the designs that I saw written there. My father was there to work on the hydroelectric system of a generating station that would dam the Nelson River and provide power to Winnipeg and other cities to the south. That was the era of great projects. All across the Canadian North, the provinces were diverting local water systems into a few larger rivers and then damming those rivers. After extensive surveying, Manitoba Hydro had identified the Nelson, which flows from Lake Winnipeg north through the Cross Lake system and ultimately empties into Hudson Bay, as an ideal site for a hydroelectric energy generating station. Some 1,500 workers and their families moved up into the forest where a clearing had been created a few kilometers from where the dam would be built. Let me skip ahead. I talk quite a lot about the beautiful wilderness and the telescope that we bought to look at the star. But here's the important part, is when I started to think about GenPeg again, we moved away, we lived there for a few years. As the years went by and one by one, my parents, brothers and sisters and their families moved from Manitoba to the Greater Toronto area. The forests of the north receded from my memory. Back in Manitoba, construction on the dam had been completed and the trailers were packed up and driven off the land. GenPeg ceased to exist. From time to time, I mused again on childhood days, but mostly those first winters of GenPeg were replaced in my imagination and in my daily life by the equally snow-filled winters of Western New York, where I mainly grew up after we left, and later the winters of Ohio, where I lived for many years. It was in the middle of one such winter in a drafty old Midwestern house in Oberlin, with a polar vortex howling down through Canada to reach its icy grip around the southern shore of Lake Erie, that I began thinking again of the town I grew up. Was the site still there? Was the dam still operational? I had no idea. I typed the word GenPeg into a search engine, but barely any results returned. The first few stories were just dry technical accounts of the generating station, which was indeed still in operation, but there was no information at all about a town called GenPeg. Then further down the feed, I happened upon an article from several years earlier entitled "Manitoba Hydro Evicted from Northern Dam Station." I didn't understand. Didn't Manitoba Hydro own the land? Who was evicting them? And on whose land had I actually grown up? I clicked on the news story to read further. The people from Cross Lake, called in their own language Pimichikamak, under the leadership of their chief, Kathy Merrick, had served Manitoba Hydro with eviction papers. 600 people had traveled the 20 kilometers from Cross Lake to take custody of the generating station and adjoining housing complex, chaining shut the doors. Merrick wrote of the 2014 occupation in a letter to the Winnipeg Free Press. And now I'm going to read you Kathy Merrick's letter, okay? Manitoba Hydro has been a great benefit to the province as a whole. Hydro employs 6,500 people, provides inexpensive power, and has brought $5.2 billion into the province from the exports of clean energy in the past decade. She puts clean in quotes. But for us, hydro is a bitter word and clean hydro is an insult. Our homeland has been ruined, the promises of fair treatment have been ignored, and to add insult to injury, literally, our hydro bills are much higher than the provincial average. Imagine if the once pristine waters in the lake by your cottage became murky and the shoreline continually washed away. Imagine your favorite childhood camping sites eroded right off the map, your industries undercut, your favorite golf course denuded, your ancestors' graves dug up, and your place of worship defiled. Imagine if you had to constantly fight for compensation and mitigation while paying monthly bills to the victimizer. Despite all the damage we suffer, our community collectively pays Hydro about $3.6 million annually in hydro bills. And every bill is a reminder of the indignity done to us. Then, after contributing to our poverty, Hydro disconnects our people when they can't pay. Chief Merrick went on to contend that Manitoba Hydro, the province of Manitoba, and the federal government of Canada had not fulfilled their agreements in the 1977 treaty with the 5 northern bands, under which Hydro received easement rights to build the generating station. So, lo and behold, the town where I had grown up was unceded reservation land. As I came to learn, since unrecorded time, that land and the people on it had been called Pimicikamak, meaning where a lake lies across a river, a fairly accurate description of the hydrogeography of Cross Lake. The Nelson River flows into the eponymous lake and then continues out of the lake on its journey north to the bay. I'm going to pause there in that.
Oh, that's great, Kazim. I actually wanted to, there are a couple of things in the chat, and then I also had a question. So Elizabeth, who noted that she's excited for the memoir and other prose, was hoping for a poem or two as well.
That's for sure.
We'll get there. We'll get there. Asked about this reading, saying, "I'm curious about spatial movement in the memoir. How does prose lend itself to these moments, or these movements rather, in a way that's different from poetry?"
Yes, that was a very challenging, because I really had to, I don't know if you were there, Elizabeth, in the earlier conversation, but I talked about the necessarily multi-genre approach to this book, that it was very much, in the beginning, the intention was that it was going to be a memoir of my childhood. I was trying to write about growing up in this strange town, you know, and the indigenous community, I barely knew them when I was a child, when I was there. I was aware that Cross Lake was close, and there were some indigenous people who worked in the town as, you know, various roles, but I did not have significant interaction with them. I didn't go, you know, out there. So the relationship, you know, when you read, say, Little House on the Prairie, you know, excellent book, by the way, by a writer named Caroline Fraser, called Prairie Fires, which is about this precise issue. But when you read a book like Little House on the Prairie about frontier life, the indigenous is excluded, except in the first book, where the Ingalls family is actually, they're illegally homesteading on indigenous land, and they're actually evicted by the government because they're past the treaty line, basically. They're homesteading past the treaty line. But you know, over and over again in American literature, we see this erasure, where we see these frontier stories, or the stories in the Old West or what have you, that either posit the indigenous as foreigners in their own land, or as villains and in a villainous role, or they're absent. They don't exist at all. And you know, that was how I could have told my own story. It's what I was heading for, because I didn't know any better. And that as I came to learn this, that desire to tell that story, actually, it did not displace my story, but what I became obsessed with is, how are these stories connected? And so I really had to move in between. There were 3 different strands. I had talked about this in the earlier event, but just to recap for the people who weren't there, there is the memoir strand of my own childhood and my memories, and you know, this return back to this landscape that, you know, had been so important to me, that was no longer present in my life. Then there's a more of a journalistic and essayistic part about describing what has happened. And I do a deep dive actually in this book into the history of all of the treaties in Canada, and the status of Indigenous people in Canada, and how they came to lose. It's somewhat different than what happened in the United States. You know, there were no military, you know, there were some, but there was no grand military expulsion of people. It all happened in legalese. It all happened in the court systems, in equally brutal ways, but the fashion was different. And I didn't think that was going to be a part of it in the beginning. But then when we were in the editorial stage and we included Indigenous, there was an Indigenous editor who was brought in. As it happened, neither publisher had Indigenous editor on staff, and so we hired somebody to come in and work on us with the book. There's a Canadian publisher and an American publisher, and she is the one who said, a lot of people don't know the history of the stuff. So you're going to have to backtrack. You're going to have to explain things. And so there's quite a lot of this book is actually journalism as well. I think of it as both. I think of it as a hybrid between memoir and journalism. And then the third strand, of course, is the meta strand of negotiating. How is it I came to write this book? What right do I have to tell the story of these people? The irony of the fact, and it's true, and I've talked about it with people from Cross Lake, we all acknowledge it, the irony that the people from Cross Lake have been telling their own stories all along, but they do not have the platform that I had as an American writer, as a Canadian writer, as someone non-Indigenous writer with a platform, that my platform is bigger and stronger. And I had journalists calling me and interviewing me, and that they did not have, that over the last 40 years, they have also been telling the story, the same one that I told in this book. So there's a lot packed in there in a way, and it could not have just been a memoir with a little bit of winking at the situation, you know, and it could not have been in a, you know, eat, pray, love under the Tuscan sun, like, you know, Kazim goes north and gets wisdom, you know, it couldn't, you know, you know, it's not that either, you know, it really had to be a book that centered the experience of the Indigenous, that acknowledged my own complicity, my complicity as was part of the crime against these people. That's what I say at one point in the book. I say I'm returning to the scene of the crime.
Yeah, thank you. It's so fascinating. I found myself reading Northern Light and thinking, first of all, enjoying the sense that you were obviously creating part of that third meta strand of discovering things alongside you. Like even just the history of the name GenPeg is something that
Yes. Yeah.
through the book. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the book, is a story that I was always told about the origin of that name, and then going up there and hearing from the Indigenous people their version of the origin story of that name, and they're two different stories. You know, so whose story is the right story in a sense, you know?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Also, Caroline's cat says 326 in the chat. Thanks,
And my cat isn't here with us because I didn't bring him to campus. My little kitty, you met him earlier. The people who were in the earlier event met him already.
Yeah, that's the bonus for coming to the earlier thing. That was fantastic. Do you want to give us a little some more reading?
Yes, I would love to read you a poem or two, maybe a new poem instead of, oh, you know what I'd actually love to read, if it's okay with you. I have a poem that's actually called Origin Story. It predates Northern Light, but it starts with that same question, where are you from? So it might be interesting too. The only way I'm gonna be able to read it though, so I shouldn't have promised it to you, but because I don't have the manuscript with me because I'm in my office. So I think it's online somewhere. And if it is, I'll read.
Okay, we froze for a second, but give it a minute. I'm sure the R1 Wi-Fi will pick back up shortly.
Read it to you from the online. Oh yeah, do you hear me now?
We got you now. I think you taxed the Wi-Fi by trying to go to a website.
It's so crazy. I'm so sorry that this is so. Okay, wait, here we are. Origin story.
All right, everyone, just be patient. You can see the poor yellow bars.
Oh, it's behind that one. That's okay.
There we go.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back with us.
I'm back with you. Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm going to read you Origin Story. Someone always asks me, where are you from? And I want to say, a body is a body of matter flung, and I'm a patriot. Let's clamor out the window. But what I say is, I'm from nowhere, which is also a convenience, a kind of lie. When I was sitting in the Mumbai airport this January on a 40-hour layover, rushing home because my mother had had a stroke and could not speak, I wondered about my words. Perhaps I am from my words, because the basic biography is ordinary. Born in Croydon to a mother and a father who on different sides of a national border were married in wartime and had to reunite in England, the only place they could both get to. Born at home, 76 Bingham Street, midwived, not doctored into the world. Taken back to India when the war was over, where I came into language, and of the 7 that were spoken in the house, I began speaking 4 as the same. Then to the cold Canadian north we went, to a town that no longer exists, on the other side of Cross Lake from the Indians, who lost everything because of the dam my father was helping to build. Then to Winnipeg, then to New York, then to Buffalo, which I think I can claim. I can say I'm from Buffalo because it is a city of poets. It's the city of Lucille Clifton. I arrived there in cold January to find my mother a little slowed down, but still self-possessed enough to cook meals for everyone, even if she didn't remember the names of all the spices she was using. She does talk by the time I arrive, but slowly and deliberately, and she has to listen very carefully to be able to respond. She pauses while she talks and cocks her head while she thinks. She does not criticize me nor say anything about my wild hair. Our ordinary silence does not seem as suffocating because I wait patiently while she strains to find each word. And what on earth does it mean that I almost like my mother better this way? When my mother went to her medical appointment, I got out my copy of Good Woman and combed through its lines to find the addresses where Lucille lived and grew up. I climb into the car with a map and a journal to drive through the snow and find those places and take photographs of the empty lots where the houses once stood. Listen, I have no answer to your question. I'm not kidding when I tell you I earned my own voice. The shape it makes in the world holds me. I have no son. Did I lose you? Did you get me again? Did I lose you?
You lost us for a smidge there, but we
You heard the poem? Did I get to the end of the poem?
maybe give us the very ending one more time.
Oh, yes. I earned my own voice. The space it makes in the world holds me. I have no hometown, no mother tongue. I have not been a good son.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Cosmo. I'll put the link to it in the chat there so people can see.
There it is, yeah. That was, it's interesting to me too, from a creative standpoint. So that a poem I wrote first, a couple years before Northern Light, but you can see the questions haunted me throughout. The same questions from the book were haunting me in that poem. I wrote it in January, I believe, of 2015. And I went back to Cross Lake in May of 2017. So it was almost 2 years later.
Can I ask you actually about the reception to Northern Light from the people at Cross Lake? Like, how has that played out?
Yeah, I mean, people are really happy about it. They're glad the story's getting out. There's some cynicism in terms of like, is it going to make a difference? But they're glad because they've been talking this whole time. Like the recent news that broke around the mass graves at the schools, is super shocking to most people, and that has been known in Indigenous communities for a long time. I heard about it when I was in Cross Lake. People were telling me that the residential school systems was like concentration camps. That's what they said. It's like kids went there to die. That has been a known thing in the community all along, but it wasn't until it came into the Canadian mainstream consciousness that people felt like they wanted to activate or do something about it. So there is some cynicism in terms of, okay, you've done this book, that's great, but what happens now. On the other hand, there's some energy. There are people who feel like, okay, this is good. You know, there is a one person who said, you know, it's good that you told it because you're a Canadian, you're one of those people. So they'll listen to you. They didn't listen to us. They won't listen to us, but they might listen to you. So there's some savviness around that. It's a very political community. You know, they're one of the last communities that have not settled nor surrendered their sovereignty claims. They're maintaining both. There are other communities who are still suing in the Canadian court system for full sovereignty. They're not the only one, but they might be the highest profile one. So it's, you know, and I've maintained relationships. If you've read the book, I've maintained my relationships with Kathy Merrick, with Anna McKay, with Daryl Setti, who is the guy who worked for the government, and with Jackson Osborne in particular, although I haven't spoken to Jackson in a few months, but he's the elder that I met in the early chapters of the book. So I've stayed in touch with people and I want to continue to maintain those relationships, and I've been invited back. So I went back twice, actually. So I went the first time, which is the trip that's recounted in the book. I did go back again the following year. And then there was a plan to go back in 2020 that was precluded by COVID. And I now have another invitation to come back by the community when the situation is clear and it's safe, because they're being very careful. They're an isolated community, but they were impacted by COVID. And even though Indigenous elders, Indigenous people over the age of 70 were prioritized by the Canadian government to receive the vaccine before anyone else. In fact, there were some incidences of fraud where people, you know, fraudulently claimed to be Indigenous to receive that, but they were still impacted by COVID, and their health infrastructure is not good there. There's no comprehensive medical facility there. There's only like a basic nursing station. There's no blood lab. There's no COVID testing site. You know, all of that is hundreds of kilometers away. So they've been very careful about opening back up again. So I don't know when it is when I'll be able to go back, but I hope to.
And some of that stuff, the medical facilities were part of an abrogated deal with the Canadian government, right? Wasn't the government
was supposed to be a hospital? Yeah.
Yeah. It's a wild story. I really,
It's a community of 6,000 to 8,000. There's 6,000 people who live in the town and another 2,000 in the surrounding lands. It should have a hospital. If it was the Canadian town, it would have a hospital in it. Yeah.
That's true. So we'd welcome, I'm just eyeballing the time. So any questions anyone has, or Kazim, if there were another poem
I'll read you one more piece. This is a piece that I actually wrote after Northern Light, and the writing of Northern Light kind of brought me to it. And it is about my grandfather, Sajad Saeed. And I describe in Northern Light, Sajad Ali Saeed was his name. I describe in Northern Light, he did die in Winnipeg. He was hit by a car. He was walking in the street and he was hit by a car. And I talk in Northern Light about how we buried him in Winnipeg. So the history of our family is scattered across continents, basically, because nobody from my family lives there anymore. Yet the patriarch of our family is buried there. So this is a short piece called Sajad Ali Saeed. The single appearance of my grandfather, Sajad Ali Saeed, in the print archive of Canada is in a captioned photograph about his death that appeared in the Winnipeg Free Press in July of 1980. Neither the man nor his name, as I know it, appears. He is identified as Muhammad Saeed, his legal name, and it would have been mine too, had my father not determined to use his own middle name, Ali, as a last name. Sajad Ali Saeed appears in the photograph as a body lying in the street covered by a white sheet. For the first time, I see the name of the man who killed him, the driver of the pickup that struck him, Alan John Dmitruk, age 35. Is he the same Alan John Dmitruk who, as I discover with a quick internet search, in 1968, at the age of 23, was convicted of armed robbery? It seems likely. Is Alan John Dmytryk still alive? It feels important to me to know. I learned the name of the man who killed my grandfather, I write later to a friend. The man who killed my grandfather. I had never written that phrase before, never thought of it that way. He died. It was an accident. We lost him. But there was a man driving that truck, a man with a life of his own that went on, though I don't know in what fashion. My grandfather lies on the road in the photograph, two policemen standing over him, and he is veiled from view, covered by the white sheet. You wouldn't have known him by the name they printed, Muhammad Saeed, nor the address that they gave, which was not where he actually lived, on Harmony Cove, but the address of his daughter and son-in-law who lived on Sterling Avenue. My grandfather was a ghost in Canada's history, unseen, unnamed, and without location.
That's beautiful. That sort of theme of homelessness is so pervasive, and even when there's something tragic about you cut it, and you didn't cut it all during that one, but for the last poem, I kept thinking about how important silencing is in so much of your work too. I think, is there a connection, do you think, between those two tropes and how they recur in your work?
I always thought of silence as a place of richness. I never thought about it as being silenced. I always thought of it as part of the quest towards knowledge, and as something beautiful and something that enables you to hear. Actually, it enables you to interact with the world when one is silent oneself. So this turn into the silences, the enforced silences, or the ways that we are silenced, or the silences in our history, or the things that we don't know about or hear about, silence as something ominous, that feels new to me, and maybe unwelcome. Yeah.
Fantastic. Lots of comments in the chat about how beautiful that was.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kazim. I think we'll leave this chat open. I'll do my sort of closing pattern. We'll see if folks have any last notes. I will put in here as well, once again, the links if you want to pick up either of Kazim's books, and then the Citadel of Whispers also, which we didn't get to hear you talk about at all yet.
But it's a fun book. It's good for it's like written for 13 to 14. I mean, you could think like book 3 of Harry Potter. That's kind of the age it's written at. But younger kids will enjoy it, and older kids too. It's a little fun story, and I had a good time writing it. It's the first book in a trilogy, so there'll be 2 others eventually. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kazim, for coming and sharing your work with us. We're currently working on next semester's events. The ones already on the books are looking fantastic, and my colleague James Miranda is going to be spearheading it while I'm on sabbatical next semester. Hooray, hooray, and thank you so much, James. If you are looking for information about those events, you can find it wherever you heard about this one. You can visit the Wells Visiting Writers Facebook page. You can go to wells.edu/visiting writers. I hope you'll continue joining us for all of these events as we go forward. And I'm actually going to just invite you all to unmute if you'd like, and we can just say thank you very much to Kazim for sharing your work. Thanks so much, Kazim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kazim.
Thank you. Fabulous. Really beautiful piece.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay cool. Be kind to each other. Drink a lot of water.
Amazing. All right. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.
Bye.
Bye-bye.